she offered an old man water, never imagining he was a millionaire CEO. The sun blazed mercilessly over the small town, and the streets shimmered as though fire had taken root in the ground. Dust hung in the air, clinging to clothes and faces, and people hurried by with their heads lowered, desperate to escape the burning heat. Among them walked Lila, a 20-year-old student, her worn shoes tapping against the pavement as she clutched her bag close to her side. She was tired from her long day of classes and errands, but her heart was still wide awake, still searching the world around her with that quiet attentiveness that always defined her. She noticed everything: how the flowers drooped under the sun, how children pressed coins into shopkeepers' hands, how mothers hurried with bags of groceries. But then something else caught her eye. Beneath the crooked shade of an old tree sat a man, hunched and weary, as though life itself had drained every ounce of his strength. His clothes were dusty, almost ragged, and his trembling hands clutched his knees for support. His lips were dry, his forehead beaded with sweat, and yet the world flowed past him without pause. People glanced but kept walking, some with indifference, others without even noticing. Lila slowed her steps, her heart tugging sharply as she watched the man struggle for breath. He looked so fragile, like an autumn leaf clinging desperately to its branch before the wind claimed it. She bit her lip, glanced at her pocket, and felt the familiar weight of a few coins, the last she had until her next part-time shift. They were meant for her bus fare home. She hesitated, torn between her own need and the stranger's suffering. But kindness, as always, won inside her heart. With quiet determination, she turned away from the bus stop and stepped into the small shop nearby. The moment she entered, a wave of cool air brushed against her flushed face, but she didn't linger. She walked straight to the refrigerator, her fingers brushing over chilled bottles until she chose one filled with cold, clear water. The glass door hissed closed behind her as she carried it to the counter and placed her coins down. The shopkeeper gave her a curious look, perhaps wondering why she would spend her last money on something so small. But Lila didn't explain. She simply walked back out into the heat, the frosted bottle dampening her hand with condensation, as if even the water itself was eager to be given. Her steps quickened when she saw the man again, still slumped in the same place, his head bowed low, as though the world had forgotten him. Kneeling gently at his side, she held out the bottle, her voice soft and respectful. "Excuse me, sir," she said, offering the water with a shy smile. Slowly, with visible effort, the man raised his head. His eyes were tired, dulled by years of unseen struggle, and yet in their depths lingered a quiet dignity that no hardship could erase. For a moment he stared at her, as though unsure if she was real, and then his hand, trembling and rough, reached out and brushed against hers as he accepted the bottle. The plastic crackled softly between them, a fragile sound in the roaring heat. He fumbled with the cap, his fingers unsteady, but managed to twist it open. Raising it to his lips, he drank, each swallow slow but desperate, as though life itself was returning with every drop. A deep sigh escaped him, not just of relief, but of gratitude too. His shoulders loosened, his chest rose and fell more evenly, and when he lowered the bottle again, his eyes looked different, softer, clearer, touched with a faint spark of life. He gazed at Lila, and though his voice was frail and shaky, his words were steady. "Thank you, my dear." Those 3 simple words carried more weight than she could have imagined. Lila's smile widened, not out of pride, but from quiet warmth. She didn't need acknowledgement. It was enough to know she had eased his suffering, even just for a moment. Around them the world kept moving, cars rushing, people chattering, but in that tiny circle of shade, time seemed to pause. The old man's tired gaze lingered on her, and Lila felt an odd stillness in her chest, as though she had stepped into a story she could not yet understand. She noticed the deep lines etched into his face, carved by years of hardship, and wondered silently who he was, what had brought him here, and why no one else had stopped. Yet she didn't ask. She knew sometimes silence was more comforting than questions. She simply stayed by his side, letting her presence be a quiet reassurance. The breeze rustled the tree branches above, and for the first time in hours, perhaps days, the man seemed at peace. He took another slow sip of water, his hands still trembling, but steadier than before. Children's laughter echoed down the street, and the sound brought a faint softness to his expression. He turned his head slightly to glance at Lila, almost to be sure she hadn't left, and when she met his gaze with a nod, he gave the smallest of smiles. The bottle was half empty now, but it had given him more than relief from thirst. It had restored a piece of his dignity. Lila sat quietly, her eyes reflecting both compassion and curiosity, but she asked nothing more. She simply stayed, because sometimes the greatest gift one could give was not water or money, but the reminder that someone still cared. The old man took another sip, slower this time, as though savoring not only the water, but also the silence that surrounded them, and Lila remained seated beside him, adjusting her bag on her lap and brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. She looked at him quietly for a moment, then let her eyes drift toward the passing crowd, and almost without meaning to, she began to speak, her words tumbling out in the soft, hesitant way of someone who rarely had a chance to share her heart. She told him that she was studying at the local college, the first in her family to do so, and though she carried that honor with pride, the weight of responsibility often felt heavier than her shoulders could bear. Her father had passed away when she was still a teenager, and since then her mother had worked endlessly to keep their home standing. But life had been unkind, leaving them with bills stacked higher than their table and dreams constantly delayed. To ease her mother's struggle, Lila explained she had taken on 2 part-time jobs, one at a cafe during the mornings before classes, and another at a small bookstore in the evenings. And between the two, her body was always tired, her eyes always red, yet she refused to give up because she believed her education would someday change everything. Her voice wavered when she admitted how difficult it was, how many nights she studied by candlelight when the electricity bill couldn't be paid, how often she skipped meals so her younger brother could have enough, and how sometimes she walked home instead of taking the bus because every saved coin mattered. The old man listened in silence, his bottle of water resting against his knee, and though his face remained calm, his eyes were alive, fixed intently on her, as though each word she spoke was more precious than gold. He asked simple questions in a low, steady voice: what subject she studied, what dream she hoped to reach, what she wanted her future to look like, and Lila answered each one honestly, though her tone carried the mix of hope and exhaustion that only someone fighting against hardship could understand. She told him she studied business management, not because it was easy, but because she dreamed of one day starting something of her own, something that would give her mother rest and her brother security, something that would to make their sacrifices worth it. She confessed that at times she doubted herself, that at times the weight of debt and loneliness almost made her quit, but then she remembered her father's last words: "Never let the fire inside you die." And those words kept her moving forward when everything else tried to hold her back. As she spoke, her hands moved unconsciously, fingers tracing the edge of her bag, as though grounding herself in the reality of her struggle. The old man leaned slightly closer, nodding from time to time, never interrupting, never dismissing, but offering the rare kind of attention that gave her courage to keep speaking. His eyes glistened faintly, though whether from the heat or from something deeper, Lila could not tell. For him, it had been years since he had sat with someone who spoke without calculation, without agenda, without trying to take advantage of what he had, and this girl, who had spent her last coins on him, was opening her heart to him without expecting anything in return. Her voice trembled at times, but she carried on, saying that even though life had been cruel, she had chosen to believe in kindness, that she had chosen to smile at strangers, to help where she could, and to keep faith that one good deed always found its way back. The man breathed deeply, his chest rising with the weight of emotions he hadn't felt in decades, and when he finally spoke again, It was not to give advice or to boast, but simply to ask, "And what do you wish for most, child?" The question lingered in the heavy air, and Lila lowered her eyes, thinking carefully before answering. "Peace," she whispered, her lips trembling. "Not riches, not fame, just peace for my mother, security for my brother, and the chance to know I've done enough." The words struck him harder than he expected, because for all his years, for all his wealth, he realized that the simplicity of her wish was something he himself had long forgotten how to ask for. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening, and though he remained quiet, inside, he felt something shifting, something awakening. The girl beside him, with her tired voice and hopeful heart, had given him not just water, but a reminder of humanity, a reminder of the values he once cherished before they were buried under years of ambition and success. The old man sat quietly, his weathered hands resting on the half-empty bottle, and while Lila's words lingered in the summer air, his thoughts drifted inward, pulled toward the life he had carefully hidden from her. He was not the man she believed him to be, not merely a tired wanderer seeking relief from the sun. His true name was Alexander Bennett, though the world knew him as Mr. Bennett, a man whose signature could shift markets and whose presence commanded boardrooms filled with ambition. He was the CEO of 18 thriving companies, each branch of his empire stretching across industries that touched millions of lives. Yet there he sat in dusty clothes, indistinguishable from any forgotten soul on the street. He had deliberately chosen this disguise, stripping away the armor of wealth, because in the silence of his own heart, he had begun to doubt everything he had built. His towers of glass and steel stood tall in the city, his accounts overflowed with figures most would never dream of, yet in those vast offices filled with polished suits, he had grown deaf to honesty and blind to sincerity. Too often, he found himself surrounded by flatterers who told him only what he wished to hear, employees and even friends whose kindness was measured by profit, not compassion. He longed, though he would not admit it aloud, to be seen not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, but as a human being, fragile and flawed. That longing had driven him to discard his fine-tailored suit that morning and step into the streets dressed in plain clothes, his hair uncombed, his shoes worn, seeking not admiration but truth. And it was in that fragile search that he had found her, the girl who had chosen compassion over convenience, who had given away her last coins not because of who he was, but because of who she was. As he looked at Lila now, her eyes bright with sincerity despite her exhaustion, he felt the weight of years pressing against his chest. How many times had he sat in banquet halls filled with gold and crystal, yet felt emptier than he did now? How many times had he been applauded for donations written from surplus, when this young woman had given from scarcity and never once asked for recognition? The contrast pierced him like a blade, awakening memories of his younger self, a boy raised by a mother who taught him to value honesty, a boy who once dreamed not of riches but of making life better for others. Somewhere along the climb, that boy had been buried under ambition, yet here, in the shade of a tree with a stranger's kindness resting on his soul, he felt that boy stir again. Mr. Bennett let out a breath, long and quiet, and though Lila didn't know it, her gesture had reached deeper than any luxury ever had. The bottle she had given him was not just water, it was a mirror reflecting back what he had forgotten. That wealth without love was emptiness, power without compassion was weakness. For years, he had surrounded himself with opulence, yet he realized now that all the comfort in the world had never quenched his thirst the way her single act had. He glanced at her again, watching the way she smoothed her skirt, unaware of the magnitude of what she had just given him. She thought she had helped a poor old man, but in truth, she had saved a soul lost beneath layers of wealth and loneliness. Alexander Bennett, the billionaire CEO, had never felt so human, so humbled and so grateful as he did in that moment, sitting in the dust, unseen by the world but truly seen by her. A week slipped by quietly, filled with Lila's routine of classes, part-time shifts, and the small responsibilities that weighed on her daily. when suddenly an envelope arrived at her modest home, its elegant seal so unlike the bills and notices that usually cluttered their table. Her mother turned it over curiously before handing it to her, and with trembling fingers, Lila opened it to find an invitation printed on thick paper, announcing she had been shortlisted for a scholarship interview at one of the most prestigious corporate foundations in the city. For a moment, she could only stare, her mind reeling with disbelief, for she had never applied for such an opportunity, never even dared to imagine her name would be chosen for something so grand. Yet the letter bore her name clearly, along with instructions for the date and time, urging her attendance at a towering building whose very name carried weight in every household. The morning of the interview arrived, and Lila dressed in her best attire, a simple but neatly pressed blouse and skirt, her hands trembling as she tied back her hair and clutched the old satchel she had carried for years. She boarded the crowded bus, heart pounding all the while, her mind rehearsing what little she might say if asked about her ambitions. As the city skyline rose before her, glass and steel shimmering in the sun, she felt smaller with every mile, her chest tightening as though she were walking into a world far too vast for someone like her. When she finally stood at the base of the grand corporate tower, she had to tilt her head back to take in its height, the polished glass gleaming like a mirror of the sky. The revolving doors opened into a lobby so pristine and vast that her reflection seemed out of place among marble floors and polished counters. A receptionist greeted her politely, handing her a visitor's badge and instructed her to take the elevator to the top floor. Lila stepped inside the elevator, her pulse quickening with each passing level, her breath shallow as the numbers climbed higher. When the doors finally slid open, she found herself stepping into a corridor lined with framed photographs of achievements, faces of leaders, and symbols of power she had only ever read about. Guided by an assistant, she was led to a pair of tall wooden doors that opened into a vast conference room where the air itself seemed charged with authority. Executives in suits sat around a polished table, their murmurs falling silent as she entered. But her eyes moved past them instantly, and when they landed on the man at the head of the table, her body froze, her heart stopping mid-beat. There he was, the old man she had helped beneath the shade of a tree, no longer in dusty clothes but in a perfectly tailored suit, his posture commanding, his presence magnetic. His hair was neatly combed, his eyes sharp yet warm, and as he raised his head to look at her, she felt the room spin with shock. The executives turned toward him with deference, addressing him with phrases like, "Mr. Bennett, sir," their voices laced with respect. Lila's hands tightened around her satchel strap as realization crashed down upon her. This was not the weary stranger she had pitied, not the fragile soul she had offered water to in desperation. This was Mr. Alexander Bennett, the billionaire CEO whose name adorned newspapers and whose empire stretched across the nation. Her knees felt weak, her breath caught in her throat, and she stood rooted to the spot, unable to decide whether to step forward or turn and flee. The contrast was overwhelming. The man who had once looked broken and forgotten now radiated power, his every movement commanding the attention of those around him. Yet his eyes never left hers, steady and calm, as though silently assuring her that she was meant to be there. For the first time, Lila realized she was walking into a story far larger than her own, and though confusion and fear swirled within her, a spark of something greater, something life-changing, was beginning to ignite in the room around her. The room hung in silence for a long moment, the weight of Lila's shock pressing against the grandeur of the space, until Mr. Bennett rose slowly from his chair, his movements calm yet commanding, and all eyes followed him as he stepped away from the head of the table. The sound of his polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor as he walked toward her. But when his gaze settled on Lila, it carried the same warmth she remembered from that day beneath the tree, the same gentle kindness that had broken through the mask of a weary old man. Her heart pounded violently in her chest as he stopped before her, and in a voice steady yet tender, he spoke words that seemed to erase the distance between billionaire and student. "You gave me water when you had so little." The sentence hung in the air like a bell, ringing truth into the silence, and Lila's lips parted as tears gathered in her eyes, for she knew in that instant he had not forgotten that the act she thought was small had meant far more than she had ever imagined. He continued, his tone carrying both confession and gratitude. "That moment reminded me of the values I once lost chasing wealth. Today, I want to return that kindness." The executives around the table exchanged startled glances, but no one dared interrupt, for they had never seen their leader speak with such humility, never seen him reveal so openly the beating heart beneath the armor of power. Then he turned slightly toward the room, his voice stronger now, resonant with authority, and he announced that Lila would be awarded a full scholarship to complete her education without the burden of financial strain. Gasps of surprise filled the air, followed by murmurs of admiration. But before those words could fully sink in, he added more. Financial support would also be extended to her family, ensuring her widowed mother and younger brother would never again struggle under the crushing weight of unpaid bills. And as if that were not enough, he declared that once her studies were complete, a role awaited her within his company, a position built not from charity, but from the belief that her spirit, her resilience, and her compassion belonged within the heart of his empire. For a moment, the room was utterly still. And then a wave of applause erupted, executives rising from their chairs, their hands clapping not only for the generosity of their leader, but for the girl who stood trembling with disbelief at the center of it all. Lila's vision blurred as tears spilled freely down her cheeks, her chest heaving with gratitude, so overwhelming she could barely breathe. Her fingers clutched the strap of her satchel as though it were the only anchor keeping her grounded in the reality of this impossible moment. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to express the avalanche of emotions crashing within her, but no words would form, only sobs of joy breaking past her trembling lips. Mr. Bennet reached out gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his smile soft, steady, and kind. And in that single gesture she felt not just the generosity of a wealthy man, but the sincerity of a human being whose heart had been touched and changed by hers. The applause continued to swell, echoing against the glass walls of the room, until it felt as though the entire building was honoring her. And in that storm of clapping hands and joyful cheers, Lila closed her eyes for a brief second, whispering silently a thank you, not only to Mr. Bennet, but to fate itself, for weaving their lives together through something as simple as a bottle of water. From that day forward, Lila's world no longer felt like a heavy burden, but like a horizon filled with light, every morning carrying with it a new sense of hope that once seemed impossible. And as she walked through the gates of her college with her scholarship secured, her head was held higher than ever before, no longer weighed down by the constant worry of unpaid bills or sleepless nights of overwork. Her mother, once weary from endless labor, now smiled more often, her laughter filling their modest home, and her younger brother chased his own dreams with renewed courage, inspired by the strength he saw in his sister. The changes around her were not merely financial. They were spiritual, emotional, and deeply human, for Lila had blossomed into a confident young woman whose spirit seemed unbreakable, her steps guided not by fear of scarcity, but by belief in the possibilities ahead. Yet what touched her most was not the scholarship or the financial stability, but the bond she had begun to share with Mr. Bennet, a bond that transcended titles, wealth, or age, a bond built on gratitude, respect, and the memory of that simple act of kindness that had tied their lives together. He became a mentor to her, offering wisdom not as a CEO dictating terms, but as a friend who saw her potential, encouraging her to dream bigger than she ever dared. And she, in return, reminded him each day of the humanity he had nearly forgotten in his pursuit of success, her presence a gentle mirror that reflected back to him the importance of compassion over profit. Their conversations stretched long into evenings, not about money or deals, but about life, choices, and the unseen value of kindness. Slowly, people around Mr. Bennet noticed a change in him. He smiled more, he listened more, and even in his towering corporate world, he began shaping policies that placed people before numbers, inspired quietly by the girl who had once shared her last coins for a bottle of water. For Lila, the journey of transformation was equally profound. The timid student working multiple jobs gave way to a young leader whose confidence and courage were nurtured under the steady guidance of a man who believed in her when she scarcely believed in herself. Time moved forward, yet neither of them ever forgot the scorching summer afternoon where it all began, for that memory became the foundation of everything that followed, proof that sometimes the smallest actions ripple into waves that change entire lives. And so, what had begun as a fleeting encounter under the blazing sun became a story etched in both their hearts, a reminder that destiny often hides in the simplest of gestures, waiting for a moment of compassion to reveal its hand. Together they carried this truth like a torch, lighting their own paths and inspiring others, for their bond was not defined by wealth or charity, but by love, respect, and a mutual promise to never underestimate the power of kindness. And as Lila stood at the threshold of her future, her heart steady and her eyes bright, she knew that no matter where Lee's Faye led her, the lesson of that day would remain forever. The reminder that one bottle of water, given in love, could become the seed of a story that would change not only her life, but countless others who heard it, proving that acts of love, however small, have the power to shape destinies in ways we may never imagine.